I just bought a lobster. No, not for dinner, not for lunch. I just bought a Red Claw freshwater lobster. You probably don't believe me. You're probably going, this is bullshit. This is supposed to be for what it's damn worth, and now he's telling me he's got a lobster. I can understand your skepticism. So just to put this to bed once and for all, take a look at that. That is a lobster. Now, I just want to talk to you about lobsters. So I had a lobster before in this tank, an aquatic habitat. I don't call it a fish tank because there's no fish in it, and there's no lobster in it at the moment either, because unfortunately the poor thing perished. Didn't get to live out a full 5-year term. There was something wrong with the water quality management, and the poor little fellow perished. Is a fascinating little animal to keep as a pet. And I want to just talk about lobsters as pets, but also just the ethics of keeping little animals as pets. I have kept fish ever since I was a young boy. I think my first fish tank was about 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters by 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters. It's a little tank, and I had black mollies in there, which are the black goldfish with the boggly eyes. And they just seem perfectly happy. I mean, I don't know how to tell whether goldfish is happy, but they lasted a long time. And anyway, then one day I was down this creek in Colchester in England, and I caught these little tiny eels, and I put them in the fish tank, in the tank with the mollies, and the fucking eels started eating the tails off the fish, you know, the big flappy tails. Anyway, so I think that was a lesson in fish tanks or aquatic habitats is make sure you get your species mix right, okay? And so then, you know, you could ask whether it's even ethical to be keeping fish. You know, is it ethical to keep a fish tank with fish in it? And I mean, that would be worth having a conversation about. I think on one hand, let's put it this way, there's distinctions to be made. So if you're keeping fish, for example, aquarium fish, which are captured out of a native environment like the Great Barrier Reef, and I've had some experience in this. I've actually been out on a boat catching reef fish, and a proportion of those fish that you take off the Great Barrier Reef perish before they get back to shore. A proportion of them perish before they leave the shop, and a proportion of them perish on the way home, and a proportion of those, you know, and then you've got to ask, what is the ecological value? What is the value to nature of collecting fish off the Great Barrier Reef and selling them to home aquarists? I would say that it's negative. I'd say it's negative, apart from the carbon emissions associated with it. You could argue that in some circumstances that you put the fish in a refugium, if it's a really well looked after aquarium, that you know, if they go extinct on the reef, then they'll at least exist somewhere else. They can be reintroduced later. You could make that argument, but that's not the same argument as keeping reef fish, keeping fish caught off the Great Barrier Reef for pets, because that's not a refugium, really. I mean, it might be in some extraordinary circumstance, but that's not the same as having a properly set up, you know, aquarium system for that purpose. So I think in that example, it would be unethical to keep fish caught from the Great Barrier Reef, okay? Then I knew a guy on Magnetic Island who knew how to actually breed clownfish, the little orange ones. And he used to sell aquarium bred clownfish. So then your ethical issues one of the ethical issues falls away, because you're not capturing them off the reef, you're actually cultivating them yourself. And I think selectively over a number of generations, you'd probably selectively breed a line of clownfish which are probably no longer adapted to being on the Great Barrier Reef, maybe. So there's a different level, there's a different ethical argument there. And then you can say, okay, well, what about goldfish? What about like the little molly goldfish, which have got no chance of surviving anywhere but a tank, really? I mean, these things are so silly that an eel will eat them while they're still awake. These things, you put them in any natural environment, they'll get swooped down and eaten. These things have been selectively bred for generations to do nothing other than live in people's fish tanks. And so, is it ethical to keep an animal that can only exist in a fish tank? In which case you could probably say yes, you should be keeping those fish, because if we're going to promote life and living organisms, then let's keep those fish, but let's not take the wild ones. And if we're going to have pet fish to promote life and to nurture life and to have life around us, then make sure we look after them as best we can. So which means do more homework on how to look after your lobsters. Like, there's a big lesson for me there, given that I've lost a lobster, 2 actually, because I got 2 in the first instance, and apparently they're cannibalistic, and so the dominant one, which ironically only had 1 claw, ate the first lobster. So at least it was well fed, I guess you could say. So basically I'm admitting to have really actually screwing up on having in lobster care, so I'm going to get right on top of that. This new lobster that I've got there is going to be well looked after. Okay, now these marron, I'm pretty sure, I'm almost 100% that these little red claw are actually grown in labs or grown in tanks. So I think that my ethical frame that I've just been describing is intact. Okay, so I'm keeping lobsters because I like to have life around me and I like to nurture it, but I need to do a better job of nurturing so that it lives out a full and successful life, and ideally maybe even gets to reproduce itself, so then I've got more lobsters. Got to have more aquatic habitats around the house then. So there's that. So let me just, now that I've dealt with some of the, just skimmed across the top of some of the ethics of keeping little animals like lobsters, how do you actually keep a lobster? And let me tell you about the tank that we had before. So it was a still water tank, which is to say it wasn't aerated, and I didn't think that would be a big problem because they generally live in muddy ponds and non-aerated places, to my understanding. I remember when I was a young lad in Western Australia, we used to go down to this dam and catch them. So that was non-aerated, that was a sort of relatively stagnant, and there were heaps of them in there. And then feeding it, so what we did was we gave it a little piece of kangaroo meat that we had, because we had kangaroo steaks one night, or it was actually kangaroo stew, I think. No, kangaroo steaks. And should have seen it, loved it, jumped on top of it, devoured it. But then thereafter we were unable to ascertain how much food it needed, and so sometimes we'd give it a little blob of meat and it wouldn't eat it, and the meat would sit in there for a few days and sort of fester, so it sort of deteriorated the water quality. So then we pull the meat out with the fingers or with a spoon and then do a water change and so forth. So the woman in the shop tells me that to give it a sinking protein feed tablet, which is fair enough. That's probably the bottled version that you get in the little plastic tub for $10. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a more sophisticated way of feeding my lobster a variety of foods, find out which one he likes, but be able to retrieve it from the tank for the material that he doesn't eat. That way it doesn't putresce in there and force the need for these constant water changes. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to rehabilitate the old aquaponics setup that I had. I bought this little electric pump and had water circulating between a lower tank with fish in it and an upper tank with these beads in it that you were able to grow plants in. So I'm going to rehabilitate that because those beads actually offered a big surface area for the nitrogen denitrification and denitrification processes that you need to get rid of the excess nitrogen in the water. So anyway, so I'm going to set that up, and then I might do another little video to show it, and I'll do a bit more research on lobsters, and I might even do a bit more research on the ethics of keeping pet lobsters, because I think I've just started this journey rather than having come to the conclusion of it. For what it's Tamworth, even though I'm technically not in Tamworth anymore, I am now in Indooroopilly. I am now back in the Big Smoke in the city, and I'm going to the shopping centre to pick up a bottle of wine and some some things for dinner. Okay, so for what it's worth, I won't be eating lobster tonight, and nor should you.